Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait 1 minute as Zoom is letting you, the audience, into the virtual room. So just give us one moment and we'll get started in a minute. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I just made a mention for those of you that are coming into the room. Um, we are just waiting 1 moment for all of you to be let into the virtual room. So we'll just get started in just a moment while we see the numbers kind of coming in. So once they start slowing down a little bit, we'll get started as soon as possible. Thank you for being here. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and get started as we have a really interesting and packed agenda for today. So I would just want to start by saying hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and also wishing you a good evening from wherever you are joining us from today. My name is Jamie Wenbesson, and I am a Senior Gender Program Manager at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. And we want to thank you so much for joining our event today, which is part two in our mini series on announcing the newest RISE Grants Challenge winners, while also launching this year's call for applications. So, in the last event that we just had a few weeks ago, we made the new winners announcement and we also launched this year's application process by publishing this year's call for proposals guide, as we wanted to give all of you a head start on reading it for several weeks so that we can have this event and then we can dive into and open up the portal for applications tomorrow. And so in today's approximately 75-minute event, we're going to dive into how to apply. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we also have a little bit of virtual housekeeping points to share with everyone today. So first, please note that interpretation is available, and also you can see some support instructions in the chat from Laura that there is language support available in Spanish and French. So if you need that, please go and click on the globe symbol in your navigation panel at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. And please be aware that this session is being recorded and it will be available on our website in English, Spanish, and French so that you can use it, share it, and also come back and pause at any point that you need to in the recording. So for today's event, microphones will be kept muted to minimize connectivity distractions. However, please use the Q&A function to send in your questions or doubts so that we can clarify and respond during the Q&A portion. And thank you to everyone who has already submitted questions during webinar registration. They have also informed the slide content, so we'll get a head start with those in the presentations today. And also, I want to share a very big thank you to the team behind the scenes, especially Jason and Laura, who are supporting us today, and also our partner at USAID and Norad, who makes the session and the RISE Grants Challenge possible. And another big thank you to our IUCN commissions for supporting today's event and amplifying the call for RISE proposals. So thank you again to the Commission on Education and Communication, the CEC, and the World Commission on Environmental Law, the WCEL. And finally, a thank you again to you, our audience, for tuning in today. Next slide, please. Um, Before we continue, we do want to be mindful and remind you that today's event relates to gender-based violence, which can be difficult and challenging. So we want to urge you to take care and thank you again for being here with us today. Next slide, please. And for a little bit of context, today's session is organized in alignment with IUCN's Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, or the GBV-ENV Center, which we host under the Advancing Gender and Environment Agent Partnership with USAID. Our goal today is to help empower you to apply for RISE Grants Challenge funding and technical support. So we hope that you will find this session informative. Now, just a brief overview of our agenda for today. We will first share an overview of the RISE Grants Challenge and 2024 priority themes. We'll hear from a couple of RISE leaders on advice that they have for you as prospective applicants as well. And Ruwani Dharmakirti will take us through application process and the eligibility requirements before reviewing some of the questions that we've already received from you. And then we'll have an open Q&A session. So please, as I mentioned, send your comments and your questions throughout today's sessions for any of the speakers. Slide, please. Okay, before we dive straight into things, let's take a quick poll. We have 2 questions for you, and we will also close with similar questions for today. And we thank you for taking a moment to help answer them as we use these survey results to help us pinpoint and refine future programming. So the first question, we would like to ask you, how confident do you feel about knowing how to apply for RISE 2024 funding and technical support? You can click 1, which is not confident at all. 2, which is somewhat confident. 3 is that you feel very confident. And 4 is that you feel great and extremely confident. So let's leave this poll up for just a moment so we can gather your responses for just a minute here. And you'll also see that there's a second question. It says, how confident do you feel about knowing how to apply for,
Sorry, when
sorry,
we
I've got
click
the
on the
questions
question,
reversed.
it's not
The
displaying when we click on the question.
So the questions are actually reversed. So let me rephrase that. The first question is, how confident do you feel understanding the thematic focus of RISE? And the second question is, how confident do you feel knowing how to apply for RISE? So I apologize, in my notes, it's the other way around. For panelists and speakers, there is not a possibility to answer the poll because, of course, we are the organizers. But for you, our audience, please go ahead and continue answering the question. Okay, with that, I think we can move on from the poll. Thank you so much to everyone that has responded to that. Thank you. All right, next slide, please. So the RISE Grants Challenge was born out of research conducted by IUCN and is coordinated in alignment with our Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, where we collate, curate, develop, and mobilize further learning on the intersection. The RISE Grants Challenge provides funding and technical support to environmental programs to learn about GBV linkages and work to address them. It was created by USAID in 2019, and IUCN took the helm, running our first call in 2022. And in late 2023, NORAD joined the grant-making basket to help us scale efforts. And as you can see from the right-hand side of the screen, the demand for support from environmental practitioners is enormous and constantly growing. So our goal is to work with grant winners to develop learning for both global policy and practical application throughout environmental sectors. Next slide, please. And just very briefly, just want to remind that today the RISE Grants Challenge is now a family of 18 projects, which have or will work in environmental topics such as wildlife conservation, indigenous managed forestry, fisheries, mining, indigenous environmental defense, and other sectors. And so in terms of the 2024 thematic scope, wanted to take some time to go over these points here. This year, the RISE Grants Challenge will seek proposals that adopt strategies to prevent, mitigate, and/or respond to the risk of gender-based violence and environmental linkages in the context of the dual global biodiversity and climate crisis. Now, within that umbrella, this year, we also have a specialized earmark for at least a few projects to specifically address gender-based violence in fisheries sectors. So we'll just go over these two focal areas in deeper in the next slides. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to dive into the umbrella theme by taking a summary look at GBV and its connections with climate change and biodiversity. Next slide, please. So in the IUCN research that I mentioned, we had three primary findings that you'll see on the right of your screen. The three findings primarily in summary are that GBV relates to who has the right to access natural resource decision-making and management based on gender, that linkages worsen when environmental pressures are worsening, and that GBV also affects the world of environmental work. Over the past few years since the publication of that research, we've also worked really hard with colleagues around the globe to affect policy change. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that examples of some of the places where there's been growing momentum in climate and biodiversity sectors. However, I will say that much of this project and policy recognition has still been quite siloed within these respective spaces. Next slide, please. So this year's call for applications centers on projects that will address GBV in the context of the dual climate and biodiversity crisis in environmental programs and projects. The reason being is that we are seeing how the impacts and effects of the concurrent environmental crises are overlapping. And the link between climate change and biodiversity is clear when it comes to forestry, oceans and fisheries management, environmental defense, and other topics that are very prescient. And so the winners of this round of RISE will be able to help inform climate and biodiversity decision makers and practitioners in a concurrent and not siloed manner. So on the screen here, you will see a few of the many, many examples on the ways that the concurrent environmental crises of climate change and biodiversity loss can negatively affect GBV. And while we won't be able to dive into every example here on this webinar, we can draw that the linkages between GBV threats and risks in relation to natural resource collection, use, and management. We can also see that conflicts arise out of established gender norms on who has the right to make decisions about these natural resources and related livelihoods and income, especially when climate stress worsens the quality and availability of biodiversity resources. And we can also see that GBV is used to silence and threaten defenders who work to protect nature from biodiversity degradation and climate change impacts as well. Next slide, please. And so moving on to our small fisheries earmark, when we think of fishing, most people in the world, we think of men on boats with reels and with nets. But really around the world, women's crucial roles are throughout natural resource use, access, and management become invisible, with potentially dire impacts for environment and gender equality. The reality is that while men are the world's predominant fish harvesters, women are usually ocean product and mollusk harvesters, as well as the first buyers at landing sites who process and market fish and also play very important roles in fish processing. So while men form approximately 85% of harvesting roles, women fill 85 to 90% of after-catch roles along the value chain, and their invisibility can generate risks. Next slide, please. So within this context, sexual exploitation can be very highly prevalent due to the gender differentiated roles that women and men have in many fishing communities that we just went through. Sexual exploitation in fisheries has many lifetime consequences. Not only do survivors suffer from trauma and stigmatization, they also experience physical violence from communities as a result of sex for fish practices. And sexually transmitted infections such as HIV and AIDS are very prevalent challenges as well. And you can see some data on the screen here about the correlation between sexual exploitation in fisheries and HIV and AIDS rates. In some regions, the practice is so common that it has a local name. In the case of East Africa, it is commonly referred to as jaboya, which means customer in local languages. And you'll see on the left a few snippets from quotes from very brave survivors who have shared their experiences. Next slide, please. So, though sex for fish violence is the most frequently acknowledged form of fisheries and GBV link, there are also many others. And while we won't be able to go through all of the examples that you see on this slide, again, we will share this recording in case you'd like to come back to it. But for now, as a summary, what we can say is that there are examples wherein gender-based violence has impeded the work of sustainable fisheries projects as conflicts arise out of either established norms on gender differentiated roles women can have in fisheries, or the time women spend engaging in fisheries conservation, or that women face challenges from protected area guards. In addition, GBV also affects women's engagement in formal work sectors, such as fishing processing plants. It also affects women in ocean sciences who have reported very high levels of sexual harassment in both marine science and learning environments. So this year's fisheries earmark will allow us to explore some of these many challenges together and help develop global learning. And on this particular note, it is my pleasure to turn this session to our RISE leaders that will share some of their insights with you. And speaking of fisheries, first up, we have Samantha Munagandu from Action Aid Zambia. So Samantha, if you can please turn your camera on and your microphone on, we'll change to the next slide and the presentation floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Samantha. I lead the RISE project in Zambia, where we address GBV in the fisheries, mainly to prevent and mitigate gender-based violence, to improve access, benefits, and control of fisheries resources in Zambia. So I'm sharing some of the strategies that we have been using to address gender-based violence, and specifically how we have been engaging males in addressing GBV in the fisheries. So I'm just going to talk about 4 main ways. Of course, we have many others and even more detailed, but I'm just going to talk about awareness raising and sensitization activities, training sessions, and our workshops, and how we have been engaging our traditional leaders, as well as the multi-sectoral stakeholder approach. So in our awareness and education programs, we have been working with the community-based committees, which of course comprises of both men and women, and utilizing diverse formats such as one-on-one sessions, gender segregated focus group discussions, household dialogues, and community outreach. We ensure that a detailed understanding and community engagement among men, predominantly the fishermen, as well as traders and others, to have a good understanding. So empowering men as facilitators and trainers in these sessions fosters relatability and encourages collective action. And the next one is through our trainings and our workshop sessions. So we equip men with the tools and knowledge to become advocates for gender equality. We have participatory sessions such as the 24-hour calendar, the power dynamics, the circles of influence that promote reflection and action by both men and women separately and then collectively in different plenary sessions. By empowering men to lead the sessions and participate in our interventions, we have cultivated a culture of respect, equality, and accountability, driving positive change in fisheries sector and even just in the wider society. Then the other one is the engagement of traditional leaders. In our approach to address gender-based violence in the fisheries sector in Zambia, we have prioritized involving men as key agents, recognizing the influence of traditional leaders as custodians of both the cultural norms and also the natural resources. We conduct targeted dialogue sessions and meetings aimed at promoting gender equality, respect, and equality for all. So by leveraging on their authority and by leading examples, and as in personally, we have effectively influenced men to openly talk about a lot of taboos around sex for fish and GBV in general, and to reject the negative aspects together. Then the last one is about the multi-sectoral stakeholder approach, which we employ a collaborative multi-sectoral stakeholder approach, engaging departments that are focused on either environmental or gender-based violence, or just gender offices and others. And through our tailored training interventions and advocacy efforts at both political and economic spheres, which are predominantly occupied by men, we have been working together to promote gender-based violence, free spaces and safe spaces, and also addressing systemic GBV. I think in conclusion, we just emphasize compatibility and collaboration among men and women in all our interventions, unlike competition, because we believe that climate change and gender-based violence and other forms of injustices are both cross-cutting, and thus we believe in working together for us to achieve the greater and positive good. Thank you so much. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and we really appreciate your insights. And so now we'll actually turn to Jocelyn Kelly from Harvard Humanitarian Initiative to tell us about building an evidence base. Jocelyn, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here with this group of GBV prevention and environmental leaders. So as a former and a current RISE grantee as part of this wonderful consortium of women rights activists in Eastern DRC, I'll be speaking about a potential approach that you could consider incorporating into your project. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about A/B testing, which is something that we did in the past in our project in Eastern Congo, but I also want to give a reminder that this is only one type of testing, or M&E, and that we encourage you to incorporate learning and testing into your projects in whatever form, because as you all know, we're in this working together to build an important and growing evidence base. And while so many strides have been taken in the past years, there is still a long way to go, and I think as one of the kind of RISE community members, we are always so eager to learn. So this approach, what is an A/B test? It's also sometimes called split testing, and you'll see why, because basically you split an intervention or an approach into two different groups, and you do this to determine which intervention or approach might be most effective by then comparing differences between the groups. What you also want to do is randomize the different groups to try to get the most valid results possible. So that might look like if you are having an intervention in, for instance, 30 communities, you might randomize 15 communities to get one type of intervention or one type of information, and 15 other communities to get a different, variation of that same intervention or variation of that same type of information. When could you consider doing A/B testing? Well, you can consider this when you have two or more versions of an approach or training or intervention, and you're trying to figure out which might be the best. When you would like to find out which is best at, in particular, advancing the outcomes that you're most interested in, like preventing GBV or improving environmental practices. It's also helpful when you have a clear theory of change and you have the ability to measure these indicators consistently over time. We also want to emphasize that it's important to have good M&E capacity and an ability to analyze the data that you gather from this. So, stretching your organization to do a really elaborate M&E approach is probably not as effective as finding the fit that's right for you and right for your team. So it's a good reminder that the best M&E is the M&E that you can realistically do and stick with throughout a project. And the next slide, please. For our 2021 RISE project, we actually incorporated this A/B testing approach by randomly assigning 2 different versions of our training to communities. And we basically tested which approach might have the most impact. The intervention and the approach were new, and that's why we really wanted to test this out and kind of hopefully create some kind of learning that could help others. So we created 2 versions of the training. One version is what we call the standard version, and it involved community organization and sharing information. And then we also created an interconnectedness version. And this version actually had a lot of exercises that were aimed at helping people recognize the interconnections between people and the environment, and really giving rise to a feeling of empathy and understanding, not only building a sense of cohesion within a community, but building a sense of cohesion of that community with the place that they lived. We were really pleased that we actually did do the A/B test, because it turned out that the interconnectedness group or the interconnectedness communities that we randomly assigned actually had a huge decrease in violence, more than we expected, while, to be honest, the standard version did not lead to that decrease in violence that women reported. So we saw sexual harassment drastically decrease from 32% to 19%, sexual coercion halved from 12% to 6%. And we just wouldn't have known these results if we didn't do the A/B test and kind of randomly assign these 2 different versions. So this is just a gentle reminder that there are interesting measurement evaluation approaches out there, and that you could consider incorporating one that feels right for you and your project team into your RISE application. Over.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And yes, knowledge is power. So thank you for walking us through the value of A and B testing as a potential strategy that applicants can consider. And so now turning to Joyce Peshu from the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association. She'll tell us a little bit about the value of working on women's economic empowerment as a strategy. Joyce, so good to see you, and over to you.
Thank you. As Jamie said, my name is Joyce Peshu from Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, and we are a membership associations of around 195 conservancies in Kenya, and we have been able to implement the RISE grant, this being the 2nd time, and based on the lessons from the initial RISE grant, which we were able to engage and use the social analysis and action model, which involves challenging gender and power norms in conservancies, we realized that we need to integrate other approaches to ensure that our program or communities are we're able to prevent gender-based violence and promote gender equity in conservancies. And so one of the key strategies that we are currently implementing is women economic empowerment in partnership with Taita Taveta Wildlife Conservancies Association. And the strategy focuses on increasing financial inclusion of women in conservancies based on the historical injustices where women were not accessing as much benefits from conservancies, and in a result will result to or perpetuate to gender-based violence. So we incorporated this strategy using the Village Savings and Loans Association. And also we realized that when women acquire resources, then they will have a voice, as in they will be able to articulate their preferences. Also, they will have agency and they will have capacity to make decisions. And that will increase their meaningful participation in decision-making at both household, community, and conservancy level. So our strategy in terms of women economic empowerment using the VSLA also focuses on strengthening the women's ability to access and control over productive resources, and specifically natural resources in this case, because over time they were not able to. You'll find that women are able to access land resources, but do not have control of these resources. So in conservancy specifically, being able to enable them to be able to purchase shares within the conservancies by also providing catalytic grants that enables the women to have financial resources for them to either grow their nature-based enterprises or for them to start nature-based enterprises. And just based on our work and our engagement with both men and women in conservancies, not having agency and voice will lead to gender-based violence at household level because women will be disregarded. But we realize from empowering them to have economic capacity, then they will have autonomy and voice. So yes, women will have autonomy and voice. Then what next? Because the community, we have both men and women. So in our next slide, I'll be able to showcase in terms of women economic empowerment. When we are working on women economic empowerment initiatives, but ensuring that these economic empowerment initiatives are safe and effective. Because what we didn't want to do is to have economic empowerment initiative that perpetuate or results to gender-based violence. So one of our key approaches that we ensured we incorporated in our work is engaging men as allies so that men can be able to support the women to promote gender equality and prevent any gender-based violence that may result from our initiatives. So we're encouraging men on positive masculinity and healthy relations, and we've been able to see these. So yes, we're having groups of women that are doing VSLA, as you can see from the picture, or they have gotten a grant to start a business. But when they go home, are their spouses or intimate partners open to this? So apart from economically empowering them, is also having dialogues with these men so that they can understand. So the other component is creating awareness. So we create awareness on the initiatives we are doing, but also create awareness on gender-based violence, on aspects of rights, on information about services, so that communities or both men and women, where they observe such gender-based violence cases, they're able to report, they know where to report. So creating awareness on GBV was also key. And also in some of the communities that we work with in Taita and in Amboseli landscape, cases of gender-based violence is normalized. There are some cases that are considered a norm. And so when we are able to engage communities to understand that, no, this is not a norm, it's a gender-based violence, it's a violence case, then also has helped us to ensure that our interventions or initiatives on economic empowerment are safe and effective. And then last but not least is aspecting of challenging harmful gender and social norms that perpetuate gender-based violence. And we've been conducting dialogues or and mostly working with the conservancies and the Landscape Association on gender-based violence so that communities, both men and women, are able to identify, reflect on some of the norms that result to gender-based violence and are able to either change their mindset to be positive, or even just collectively have an action on ensuring that gender-based violence is prevented or reduced. And we believe that integrating these considerations create environment that both empower women economically while reducing the risk of gender-based violence when we are doing some of these interventions. So what I will say to close this is that in any interventions that we propose, we need to identify some of the risk that might come up by doing these initiatives and ensure that we incorporate strategies that will reduce this risk, especially the risk of gender-based violence. Yeah, thank you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and thank you so much to all of our RISE leaders for your very, very valuable advice and your based on your experiences. So thank you again. Now, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Ruwani Dharmakirthi, who is our RISE Grants Challenge Manager, and she will be taking us through the application process and eligibility requirements. So over to you, Ruwani.
Thank you so much, Jamie. In this next portion of the presentation, we will go through the application process and eligibility requirements, respond to some of the questions submitted through the webinar registration link, as well as through the Q&A function. So please do feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. Next slide, please. Here we have a snapshot of the 2024 RISE Grants Challenge call for proposals. As Jamie touched on earlier, the thematic scope for this year is strategies to prevent, mitigate, and respond to the risk of gender-based violence and environmental linkages in the context of the dual global biodiversity and climate crisis. And this year, there's also a specific earmark for at least several projects to specifically address gender-based violence in fisheries sectors. We expect to award up to 6 awards between USD 100,000 to USD 400,000, with an implementation period between 18 to 24 months. 18 countries are eligible for the RISE Grants Challenge this year, and applicants can also apply for non-area-based projects focused on global policy to address gender-based violence and environment linkages. The application process includes submitting an expression of interest by June 7th, and after an eligibility screening, there will be a limited invitation to develop a full proposal. Partnerships are a requirement, and we also require that at least one partner must have in-country presence, and community-based organizations should be integrated into partnership structures. Next slide, please. This year, the RISE Grants Challenge seeks to invest in 3 primary ways: through existing environmental projects that leverage RISE funding and technical support to embed gender-based violence prevention, mitigation, and/or response in an integrated manner to environmental work, or existing gender-based violence and environment programming that aims to continue, scale up, or replicate an intervention, or new projects that address gender-based violence and environment linkages at the global policy level. You can read more about this in section 3 of the Call for Proposals document. Next slide, please. We will be having a 2-step application process similar to last year: the expression of interest and then a limited invitation for eligible organizations to develop a full proposal. The expression of interest application consists of several steps, including downloading necessary forms, acknowledgements, providing lead applicant contact information. There will be several eligibility questions, the technical expression of interest questions, as well as uploading the RISE declaration form and the lead applicant and partner registration documents. The expression of interest stage will open tomorrow, 10th of May, and is open until the 7th of June at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Once this stage closes, an eligibility screening will be conducted, and a select number of eligible expressions of interest will be selected for the full proposal stage, based on overall eligibility, as well as alignment with RISE Grants Challenge 2024 objectives. At the expression of interest stage, you do not have to develop a budget activity plan or a log frame. It is a very simple application. Applicants that are invited to continue to the technical application must also submit their application through the same online platform. The technical application will be more in-depth and will also require a budget, activity plan, log frame, and the IUCN Environmental and Social Management System Assessment Questionnaire. Those selected to develop the technical proposal will be notified by July 1st and must submit your proposals by July 31st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Next slide, please. Thank you. Expressions of interest must be written and submitted using the online application platform available at SM Apply. You can find the link at our website. The application system and forms are available in English, French, and Spanish. We are not accepting applications in any other languages for this year, and offline applications will not be accepted. You must use the online portal to submit your application. The primary working language for the RISE Grants Challenge and related cohort peer learning and training is English. Please note that the review processes, communications, interviews with prospective applicants, and due diligence processes will be conducted in English. Next slide, please. The call for proposals can be found at the RISE Grants Challenge website and is available in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. It's important that you read through the call for proposals document, as all necessary information, including the application process, timeline, and all eligibility requirements are within this document. The eligibility requirements includes eligible geographies, applicants, partnerships, requirements, programmatic requirements, administrative requirements, what RISE will not fund, and ineligible applicants. You can learn more about eligibility requirements in section 4 of the call for proposals document. Again, I just want to emphasize that reading the call for proposals is incredibly important before you submit your expression of interest application. Once you submit, you cannot make changes to your application and would need to delete your submission and start over. You must submit your expression of interest application by the 7th of June at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so moving on to eligible countries. Proposed projects must be implemented in 1 or more of the eligible countries. We have 18 countries that are eligible, and they are listed here on this slide. In addition, this year, we will also accept applications that are non-area-based projects focused on global policy to address gender-based violence and environment linkages. Please note that non-area-based projects must be non-area-based and is not a stand-in for ineligible geographies. As you heard Jamie earlier, there are opportunities to influence global policy through RISE, including through submitting a non-area-based project focused on global policy, which can include things like capacity building and technical support to climate and environment decision makers. You can also find this list of eligible geographies in the call for proposals document in Annex 1. Next slide, please. Moving on to eligible applicants, the RISE Grants Challenge is open to legally registered local, national, regional, or international organizations, such as non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, Indigenous peoples organizations, civil society organizations, and so on. You can find the full list in section 4.2 in the call for proposals document. Please do note that governments and public entities are not eligible applicants and can only be engaged as stakeholders. You can also find a list of ineligible applicants in section 4.8 in the call for proposals document. Next slide, please. Moving on to partnerships. So partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, are a requirement for the RISE Grants Challenge. And in the expression of interest application, you must clearly identify your partners. If you give examples of partners and do not clearly identify a partner, your application will be deemed ineligible. Please note that government and public entities, as I mentioned before, are not eligible applicants or partners and can only be engaged as stakeholders. At least one of the partner organizations must have a local presence in the proposed country of implementation, and you are required to submit the lead applicant and partner organization registration documents to confirm eligibility and local presence in the expression of interest application. At least one of the member organizations must have gender-based violence expertise, or all organizations must commit to hire a GBV expert as staff or fully integrate GBV consultants within your projects. Requirements for partnerships and collaborations can be found in section 4.3 in the call for proposals document. Next slide, please. Local presence is an eligibility requirement for RISE as well. The lead applicant must already have a presence in the country where the activities are proposed, or be a local organization, or have a duly registered local partner that meets the requirements for consortia and partnerships. It is also highly preferred that at least one of the partners is a grassroots, locally led organization who possesses the capability, connectedness, and credibility to drive change in their own countries and communities. Next slide, please. In terms of the thematic responsiveness, expressions of interest must address the scope, purpose, and objectives of the RISE Grants Challenge, ensuring to address gender-based violence and environment together while incorporating approaches that integrate community-led or driven approaches, as well as survivor-centered and trauma-informed approaches. Women's economic empowerment approaches should be conducted in tandem with gender-based or gender-responsive approaches, such as engaging men and the wider community as a gender-based violence prevention strategy. We also want to see approaches that promote institutional learning and contributes to filling knowledge gaps through strategies, tools, and capacities. You can find a full list of approaches in section 4.5.1 in the call for proposals document. Next slide, please. IUCN has zero tolerance for sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Applicants will be expected to either have SEAH policies and procedures or to include their development as part of their RISE activities in order to be in compliance with IUCN. Self and collective care is an important strategy for ensuring the well-being of those working on gender-based violence. RISE applicants have an ethical responsibility to do no harm and mitigate risks to the psychological well-being and safety of their staff. As such, in the expression of interest application, you will be asked if the lead and partner organizations will incorporate structures and frameworks for self and collective care to ensure the well-being of those working on gender-based violence. Should you be invited to develop a full proposal, you will have to expand on this in the technical proposal and include it within your budgets. Next slide. The RISE Grants Challenge requires that organizations have sufficient capacity for professional and timely implementation of the project. This will be further assessed during the due diligence stage. With no exception, the final selection is conditional on a successful due diligence process. You can refer to section 5.6 in the call for proposals for more information on the due diligence process. Finally, the call for proposals document also covers interventions that the RISE Grants Challenge will not fund. You can find the full list of examples in section 4.7 in the call for proposals document. Examples of interventions that the RISE Grants Challenge will not fund include projects that focus on a single component of the issue. For example, standalone programs that address gender-based violence that are not connected to the environment. The RISE Grants Challenge will also not fund if you don't have partnerships with relevant stakeholders. For example, if you have a government or public entity as your partner, or then that will not be funded. We will also not fund activities that center around the provision of equipment, construction, land purchase, or building new infrastructure, or that center around the procurement or provision of agricultural inputs, including the purchase and distribution of seeds, tree planting, purchase of agricultural equipment or inputs, or projects that are strictly research focused. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so we've integrated many of your webinar registration questions into the content of the PowerPoint, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time directly answering a few more questions before we move on to the Q&A portion of our webinar. So the first question is, why is country X, any country you can think of, not on the eligible country list? And the reason is that the geographic scope for the RISE Grants Challenge changes every year. If the specific country is not eligible this year, we encourage you to register for the GBV-ENV Center mailing list and check for future calls for proposals. Another question we received was whether current grantees of other USAID or NORAD projects can apply for RISE. And the answer is yes, you can apply if you are awarded by USAID or NORAD under a different mechanism or project. Another question that we received is addressing gender-based violence in fisheries sector a preference or a requirement for RISE? So this is not a requirement that your expression of interest must focus on addressing gender-based violence in the fisheries sector. The RISE Grants Challenge will accept applications addressing gender-based violence spanning diverse biodiversity and climate sectors and contexts. And this year, there is also a specific earmark for at least several projects to specifically address gender-based violence in fisheries sectors. So again, it is not a requirement. Another question we received was whether the applicant organization must be registered with SAM, and no, this is not a requirement. Another question is, can you clarify what you mean about project focused on global level policy as part of your requirement? As I mentioned earlier, if you are submitting a non-area-based application, the proposed idea must focus on addressing gender-based violence and environment linkages through global level policy. For example, this can include building capacities and providing technical support to environment decision makers. Another question that we received was, can one applicant submit multiple expressions of interest? The answer is yes, you can submit multiple expressions of interest, but organizations can only be selected for one award. Another question that we received was, does the RISE Grants Challenge expect individual organizational proposals only, or can the proposals be in partnership? As I mentioned earlier, partnerships are a requirement for the RISE Grants Challenge. Applicants that fail to clearly identify partners will be deemed ineligible. Next slide, please. So we will now move into the Q&A portion of our webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions related to the application process, thematic scope, and any questions you might have for the speakers that you've heard from today. We'll be taking those questions now. Alrighty, so we have a question on whether an A-B approach is mandatory in the RISE projects. No, it is not mandatory. This is one approach that you could consider integrating as a methodology to measure change within your project. So it was just an example of one of the methodologies that you could incorporate under M&E. We have another question. There are 3 suggested approaches to projects: A, existing environment project; B, scaling up replicating; and C, global policy level efforts. To what extent can new projects combine approaches? Is it of interest, for example, to combine A and C? I think the answer here is that we are really looking to scale up existing environmental programs and actions, as well as existing gender-based violence and environment programs. And of course, we are also looking to see what types of new projects that are focused on global policy will come out of this. You can, of course, see how your project might fit into these 3 separate categories. Yeah. Another question that we have is, what is the difference between existing projects and continuing projects? So existing projects might be an environment project that exists but is not currently addressing gender-based violence. And continuing or scaling up a project might be an existing gender-based violence and environment project that wants to continue or scale up their efforts. Another question that we have received is, can we consider this grant opportunity as a supplement to the existing project, which is focused on overall protection issues addressing social norms, gender-based violence, etc.? So here I just want to emphasize that it needs to be an environment-focused project. So as long as your project is also incorporating elements of addressing gender-based violence in an environmental context, then yes, you could consider it. We have another question here. What does the expression of interest consist of? Any page limits for the expression of interest? The expression of interest application you will find in SM Apply. Everything you need to do will be there. There are different stages, which include answering questions about the lead applicant and providing basic information. There is an eligibility questionnaire. There is, of course, the technical expression of interest questions, and all of these questions do have word limits, and the application itself will prompt all of that. And you will also need to submit the registration documents for the lead and partner organizations, as well as a RISE declaration form that you will download at the start of your application. Another question says, the call states that it will not fund interventions that center around the provision of equipment, construction, agricultural inputs, so on and so forth, the project. And the question here is, can you include some of these, but the only limitation is that they cannot be the primary activity or intervention. The answer here is that we do not want you to include any of these activities in your proposal. So please make sure that you read through the section that is called What RISE Will Not Fund, which is section 4.7 in the call for proposals. Right, looks like we have some questions for some of our speakers. Jocelyn, there is a question here for you. Two questions, actually. What were the specific factors that defined interconnectedness and how were they implemented in practice? And where did you conduct the A and B testing in the DRC? Jocelyn, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. So it's a lovely question about the interconnectedness piece. And the truth is, one, we were really grateful to RISE for funding this because it felt like we were exploring something really important, but also kind of new. Our sense was that we were trying to address twin challenges. One challenge was violence against women, and the other challenge was kind of abuse of the environment or lack of protection of the environment. And we felt that underlying both issues was a sense of need to help people understand how they were connected to the environment, how they were connected to each other. And in order to address this sense, what we did in that version of the curriculum that we called the interconnectedness version, we undertook empathy exercises. So really helping people deeply connect with each other and understand each other's perspectives and problems, their hopes and their dreams. We had people work together on projects, and we also had people reflect on how their connections to their place, to their environment, and to their kind of physical and, I guess you would say, moral community affected their own lives. And we undertook, like I said, exercises, and we added information around that sense of empathy, interconnectedness, cohesion. And that is, it seems like, what really helped move the needle on reducing violence against women as reported by women themselves. This is something I care about and love talking about a lot. So I'm always happy to connect with folks. And also I will say IUCN has published some of the results and the materials from previous projects. So I think that is available as well. On the second point, and I apologize, you asked about where we did this work and kind of which communities. I think I'll spare you the exact community lists and how we randomized, but we did the project work in South Kivu, North Kivu, and Maniema. And we had a number of project sites in each one of those provinces. And then, as I said, randomize them into one of the two groups. And, you know, I would just say this to the group: the randomization does not have to be super complicated or difficult. You don't need special software. You could even, honestly, if you're randomizing into two groups, take a coin and flip it. You just have to really, really commit to true randomization, which is whatever answer comes up, that's exactly what you do, and you do not change it for any reason. I hope that's helpful. And again, there's more details about the project that are available.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. We also have a question for Joyce. Joyce, do you have a specific curriculum for the dialogues and is it published? Joyce, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so for the dialogues, we've been using the social analysis and action model from CARE, Kenya, and for the dialogues. But currently we have contextualized the essay module to fit the conservation sector and specifically wildlife conservation, but also anyone in the conservation or environment sector can use it. We are currently finalizing on that module, and it will be published, and so it will be available within the KWCA website, and I'm sure even IUCN will popularize it, and so it will be accessible to all in terms of the module for the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. So we have some other questions here. Can an organization that has already been a beneficiary in the past apply? Yes, previous RISE applicants are eligible to apply, and these applicants must specifically articulate how another grant builds on the learning and results of the first. Another question here is, are UN agencies eligible? Yes, UN agencies are eligible, but we do strongly encourage that within partnership structures, local community organizations are incorporated. Another question is, can profit-making institutions such as research organizations apply? For-profit organizations must clearly demonstrate that the proposed project pursues strictly non-profit objectives and does not generate any income. You can see the full list in section 4.2 in the call for proposals document. We have another question here. Does the RISE Grants Challenge allow for specific research? So research is allowed, but RISE will not fund strictly research-focused projects, and you can learn more in section 4.7 in the call for proposals. We have another question here. Can RISE fund the production of quantitative and qualitative information on gender-based violence or to set up an observatory? So as RISE does not fund strictly research-focused projects, we suggest that you look at anchoring a proposal on global biodiversity and/or climate policy results and impacts. On development of programs, would RISE offer technical assistance to the members? We do through the GBV-ENV Center. RISE grantees will benefit from technical support throughout implementation of projects. We have a few questions here regarding budgets and percentages and requirements on programmatic and what to consider in a budget. And I just want to reiterate that at the expression of interest stage, budgets are not requested. Budgets will only be submitted by those invited to present detailed technical proposals. You can see section 4.7 on what RISE will not fund, and there is also an Annex 3 in the call for proposals, which provides guidance on the budget form. If you were selected to develop a technical proposal, the budget form also provides a lot of guidance on what to include and what not to include. We have another question here on, let's see, can we use technology as our solution for the project? Yes, you can include a methodology that uses technology as part of the solution. We have examples from previous RISE applicants and current applicants. So you can take a look through our website and see what you find there. We are getting several questions on whether a specific approach would be possible, and we're not able to give exact guidance on whether a thematic approach or methodology is possible. A reminder that RISE funds work to address gender-based violence and environment linkages. So please read through the call for proposals document to determine whether your approach would be a good fit for the RISE Grants Challenge mechanism. And we also encourage you to take a look at what RISE will not fund to understand which activities are not eligible under RISE. So we have some questions here on partnerships. Does the partnership need to be formally registered? The partnership itself does not need to be formally registered, but all partners, including the lead applicant, need to submit your legal registration documents together with your expression of interest application. There's another question here. Do we include the partnerships in the initial expression of interest? And the answer is yes. You will be asked to identify your partners, and we would like for you to very specifically identify who you will work with should your expression of interest be selected to go into a full proposal. We have another question here. Does the RISE Grants Challenge require the applicant organization to match funds? Cost share is not required, but it is encouraged. We have some questions here on previous projects have typically focused on one country. What is RISE perspective on multi-country projects? I think this just depends on the applicant's ability, scope, capabilities to manage projects in multiple countries. I do want to note that the project lengths are 18 to 24 months, so it's not a whole lot of time. So I think that can be one consideration when you're thinking about applying for a multi-country project. And also keep in mind that we do have a reduced geographic scope this year with only 18 countries eligible under RISE. And that does not count the non-area based global policy focus. We have some other questions here. Please clarify more on projects based on global level policy. As I've mentioned before, this can include technical support or capacity building for environment decision makers. We have a question here. What is considered local presence in a country? For example, if we have local staff working on projects in a country but are not legally registered in the country, is that still considered as having a local presence? So local presence means that we do want to see at least one of your partners has a local registration in the country of implementation. This means that whether it's the lead applicant or one of your partners, somebody is based in the country and the communities in which the activities are taking place. And we check this through the registration documents, which you must submit at the expression of interest stage. We have another question here. Are publicly funded universities ineligible to be involved even as a partner organization? So as I've mentioned a few times throughout the presentation, governments and public entities are not eligible partners or applicants under the RISE Grants Challenge. They can only be engaged as stakeholders, not as formal partners. We have another question here. Does RISE require the establishment of new partnerships, or can it be used to bring new capacity to existing partnerships? Yes, you can apply through an existing partnership, or you can apply as a new partnership under RISE. We also have another question here. Can several local organizations partner to apply for RISE? Yes, we encourage that and welcome it very much. Looks like we're getting towards the end. There's a question here about the due diligence approach when selecting an organization. You can read more about the due diligence process in the call for proposals in section 5.6 to learn more about the due diligence process. Alrighty, I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone for submitting your questions, and please do remember that you can keep reaching out to us with questions through the rise@iucn.org email until the 17th of May. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so what is next? The online application system will open tomorrow on the 10th of May. It opens at 12 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Once the application portal opens, you can start your expression of interest and submit your application through SM Apply. If you have any issues, feel free to reach out to us. You can submit questions to rise@iucn.org until the 17th of May. We will collect all of these questions and post the most frequently asked questions on our website by the 22nd of May. As a reminder, once expressions of interest applications must be submitted by Friday, 7th June at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please kindly note that late and incomplete submissions will not be accepted. After this, an eligibility screening will be conducted and selected applications will be invited to submit full proposals, and the remaining grant award timeline is available online through our website as well as through the call for proposals document. Let's go ahead and take the poll again that you took at the start of this webinar. We have the same 2 questions as before, and we thank you for taking a moment to answer them as they help us pinpoint future programming. The first question is, after the webinar, how confident do you feel about understanding the thematic focus of RISE 2024? The options are not confident at all, somewhat confident, very confident, or extremely confident. The second question is, after the webinar, how confident do you feel about knowing how to apply to RISE 2024? The options are not confident at all, somewhat confident, very confident, or extremely confident. We will give you a few minutes to select your responses. Alrighty, so thank you so much for taking the time to respond. Next slide, please. And thank you so much for joining the webinar today. You will find a recording of this webinar on the RISE Grants Challenge Call for Proposals website in the next day or so, and we look forward to seeing your applications. Thank you so much again, and as a reminder, the application portal opens tomorrow. Thank you.